Chapter 7. Loose lips sink ships. Now, watch your step around this part of the vessel. We don't want the tour to get any more haunted than it already is. Mwahaha. The tour guide was laying it on pretty thick at this point in the tour. I imagine his job, while once exciting, had become rather mundane and reluctantly routine. Coming up with new puns for the same old storyline must be exhausting. Under this very bulkhead, we lost our last crew member to a freak accident. What? What happened? See this door here? He said while pounding on the metal frame of the door. The pounding reverberated throughout the room. It shuts automatically as a fail-safe mechanism. A fail-safe? Katharina asked curiously. In the event a fire breaks out in the engine room, these corridors lock down as tight as a drum. Lovely. Don't worry. The feature has been disabled for some time now. Like I said, this solid iron door comes down in the event of a fire, floor, or engine failure. And it comes down quite hard. As you can imagine, if you get into a fight with a 500-pound door, the door always wins. At least it was a quick death, Mike said while shimmering. Quite the contrary, actually. The door crushed the legs of the crewman and kept him alive for an hour or so. All accounts were that the hallooing screams of the crewman languished for that entire hour and could be heard throughout the ship. Not all were so lucky. Mike stood there speechless with a big stupid grin on his face. The kind of grin you see people make after witnessing something truly jarring. I mean, what was I supposed to say at that point? I felt it best to just shut my mouth for a while. I had 2 ears and 1 mouth. Time to start acting that way. The fastest way to get shit off your boot is to step out of it as fast as you step into it. Kat pulled Mike aside and whispered, "The bloody footprints are a little over the top, don't you think?" Mike scrunched his eyebrows at Kat as she pointed to a fresh pool of blood. From their position, Mike was barely able to make out the blood. Yeah, that seems somewhat excessive. I mean, who does that? Tells gruesome tales of fellow employees and has the gall to set up a trail of fake blood. There's a time for decorum and a time for schadenfreude. Now was not the time for the latter. Excessive? The tour guide inquired. The tour guide had phenomenal hearing, or I had unknowingly lost all respect for my own volume. The trail of blood over there, Mike said and pointed. The tour guide turned his head towards the pool of blood. To our surprise, he was equally perplexed by the attraction. The tour guide murmured in an incoherent response. From his response, I gathered the tour guide had no idea why there was blood on his floor. I didn't rule out the possibility of this being some elaborate hoax, but it certainly merited further investigation. "Oh, shit," Mike responded. "What is it?" Kat asked. "Stay here," Mike said while pulling out his smartphone and turning on the flashlight. He shined the light and crept to the pool of blood. Mike squatted down and inspected the dampened pool of blood. The tour guide stood over Mike, peering over his shoulder, like a spotter sitting over a sniper. "I take it this ain't part of the tour," Mike said while looking back at the guide for confirmation. The guide stood there with a gaping hole where his lips used to be. In a way, that was a confirmation of sorts. Mike went back to inspecting the blood for a source. All of a sudden, I felt a firm pat on my shoulder and jolted up. The guide broke my concentration, and just as I turned to confront him, he pointed at something lingering in the corner of the room. I looked over with keen observation. Is that what I think it is?" "Oh my God," the guide said while holding back vomit from his mouth. To my dismay, there was a body lying face down in a large pool of blood. "This definitely isn't part of the tour." "Mike, what is it?" Kat asked eagerly, waiting for some kind of explanation. The tour guide was too occupied to be useful in an emergency. He relegated himself to a stairwell where he frantically concentrated on his breathing. So I did what I did best. Control freak engaged. People, we've got a crime scene on our hands here. Everyone watch your step and start to trace your steps backwards. The group disembarked from the boiler room like a bunch of clowns exiting a clown car. There wasn't much decorum, mostly distraught tourists fleeing for dear life. Mike walked over to the tour guide and propped him up against the wall. The way I figured it, he was no good to me passed out on the ground. I needed to literally and figuratively pick him up. I need you to call 911. Can you do that? I grabbed him by the lapel and stared daggers into his eyes. In an emergency, people tend to do one of three things. People tend to lead, people tend to follow, people tend to get out of the way. People were rather predictable in that regard. I needed to find out what kind of person he was, and fast. Look at me. Can you do that for me? I can. The tour guide whipped out his cell phone like a gunslinger in a duel. His fingers wiggled and wavered as he dialed for help. The other guests uncontrollably shrieked and moaned as the seconds passed. As the tour guide explained the situation to the operator, Mike walked toward the gloomy group of guests. Everyone needs to remain calm. This is a crime scene. Yeah? Who are you? One of the more passionate guests shouted. Me? I'm Mike Allen. Now, like I was saying. Mike Allen, you say that like I'm supposed to care. There's a dead body over there, one of the guests pointed out. Trust me. Trust you? Get the heck out of here. Why should we trust you? My grandfather was a world-famous detective. Great. Where is he? Sure wish he was here right now. Yeah, me too, but he isn't. Instead of him, you've got me. I'm here, right now. What do I know about crime scenes? The peanut gallery continued to rumble with a lackluster appreciation of the situation, like the audience at a middle school rendition of Julius Caesar. In times of crisis, it was paramount to quell dissenters by forcing them to submit. Dissenters often cause more chaos in times of great uncertainty. In his best baritone, Mike doubled down by saying, "What I do know is that the first person who discovers the body often solves the case. What I do know is that a small detail will often make the biggest difference."